The 30th time, she didn't scream. Not because the pain was gone. The pain was never gone. But Anarcha had learned, after 29 operations, after 29 times strapped to that wooden table in a converted barn in Montgomery, Alabama, that screaming changed nothing. The man with the instruments would continue. The men watching would continue taking notes. And when it was over, she would be carried back to her quarters, bleeding, and expected to be ready again whenever he decided it was time. No chloroform, no ether, no mercy. Just the same barn, the same table, the same hands, and the same quiet certainty, repeated to anyone who questioned him, that it was fine, that she could handle it, that women like her, his words, felt pain differently. That was 1849 in Alabama. That same year in New York City, a man in a fine black coat stepped onto a stage to thunderous applause. Same man, different room. Here, there was no barn smell, no blood on the floor. There were crystal glasses and pressed linen and the warm glow of gaslight on the faces of doctors, journalists, city officials, all of them standing, all of them clapping for a genius, a pioneer, a man who had solved one of the great unsolvable problems of women's medicine. He bowed slightly, modest, composed. No one in that room said the name Anarcha. No one said Betsy. No one said Lucy. Welcome to Faded Truth's History, the channel that digs beneath the monuments, beneath the applause, beneath the official version, to find the names that got buried so someone else could be remembered. Today we are not telling the story of the man in the fine black coat. We are telling the story of 3 enslaved women in rural Alabama, whose broken bodies became the foundation of modern gynecology. 3 women who had no choice, no voice, and no record beyond a first name scratched into a doctor's notebook. 3 women who endured what no human being should endure, Anarcha alone, 30 times, while one man built his legacy on the ruins of their suffering. He got a statue in Central Park. It stood for over a century. In 2018, protesters finally surrounded it with signs, 3 names on cardboard in the rain. And the city of New York, after 124 years, quietly agreed to take it down. But here is what they cannot take down. What actually happened in that barn. What those women actually survived. And what modern medicine still owes them, and has never paid. 3 names, no last names. To understand what happened in that barn in Alabama, you first have to understand the world those 3 women woke up in every single morning. Not the world from textbooks. Not the world of dates and legislation and carefully worded compromises between northern senators and southern gentlemen. The real world. The one with dirt floors and iron shackles. And the particular silence of people who have learned that certain sounds, crying too loud, laughing too free, speaking the wrong word to the wrong person, carry a price that comes due without warning. This is Alabama, 1845, and it is one of the most brutal landscapes in the history of the American South. The foundation has a name. By 1840, Alabama had transformed itself in less than a generation into one of the wealthiest cotton-producing states in the country. Montgomery gleamed with new money, marble-columned banks, imported carriages, gentlemen in white suits debating philosophy on wide verandas with the easy confidence of men who had never once wondered whether their labor belonged to themselves. That wealth had a foundation, and the foundation had names. Nearly half of Alabama's entire population was enslaved. Half. The plantation economy ran on one simple and monstrous logic. Human beings were capital, listed in wills alongside furniture and livestock, insured, mortgaged. When a planter needed a loan, he used his enslaved people as collateral, living, breathing human beings reduced to a line item on a banker's ledger. And within that system, enslaved women occupied a particular kind of hell, because they were not just labor, they were expected to reproduce it. What happened to women? An enslaved woman in 1840s. Alabama carried a weight that had no single name. She worked the fields the same hours as men, under the same sun, toward the same quota, with the same punishment waiting if the numbers came up short. But she also carried everything else. She nursed the planters' children and then returned after dark to tend to her own. She was subject to sexual violence with no legal recourse, because the law did not recognize rape when the victim was property. She watched her children grow, knowing that any morning, without warning, they could be loaded onto a wagon and gone forever. And when it came time to give birth, when her body went through the most dangerous physical event a human being can experience, she did it with no doctor, no hospital, no trained help in most cases. Just a cabin, a dirt floor, other enslaved women around her, holding generations of knowledge accumulated through sheer necessity. In the best cases, that knowledge saved lives. In the worst cases, it wasn't enough. And sometimes, after a labor that went wrong, a baby positioned badly, a delivery that lasted too long with no intervention, a woman was left with an injury that medicine in the 1840s had essentially surrendered on. Not a death of the body, a death of everything else. The injury that erased them. It was called a vesico-vaginal fistula. The name is clinical, the reality was not. During an obstructed labor, when a baby cannot pass through the birth canal and the process stretches on for hours, sometimes days, the sustained pressure tears through the tissue separating the bladder from the vaginal wall. The result is a hole that does not heal. A woman with this condition loses all control over her own body, constantly, without relief, without pause. There was no surgical treatment, no reliable cure. The medical establishment had looked at this problem and, for the most part, looked away. For an enslaved woman, the consequences went far beyond physical agony. She became untouchable. Plantation owners viewed her as worthless. For field work, for housework, for reproduction. The same system that had extracted every ounce of labor from her body now discarded her, because her body had broken under the weight of that extraction. She would be moved away from others, isolated, existing in a kind of living erasure, breathing, but already treated as though she had ceased to matter. This is where we find our three women. Three women, Anarcha was 17 years old, 17, barely out of childhood, when she survived a labor that lasted 3 days, 72 hours. The baby did not survive. And when the people around her understood the damage that had been left behind, her owner made a decision he recorded with the casual indifference of a man discarding a broken tool. He sent her away. Betsy was roughly the same age. Her labor had been similarly catastrophic, a delivery that went on too long, in a cabin, with no help that could stop what was already happening. What she looked like, what she thought, what she felt in the days after. History did not consider worth recording. She was delivered to the doctor the way you deliver something you no longer have use for. Lucy had survived her delivery, but not escaped it. She was older than the other two, a woman, not a girl, and the condition had already begun its slow, relentless work of separating her from the life she had built, from her community, from the small dignities that enslaved people carved out for themselves against every effort to deny them. 3 women, 3 different plantations, 3 different owners. One identical calculation, broken, disposable, useful only as raw material for someone else's ambition. They were offered to the doctor, not as patients seeking help, not as people with a choice, as material, as the thing a theory needs before it becomes a discovery. The Dr. James Marion Sims was 32 years old, and he was the kind of brilliant that certain men are, sharp, focused, relentlessly ambitious, with one critical blind spot. He could not see the people on his table, not really, not as people. In his memoirs, the book he later published to cement his legacy, written in the warm glow of international fame, he described the moment these women were brought to him with barely concealed excitement. He wrote that he was not long in determining to use them. Not long. As though the only question worth asking was a logistical one. As though the frightened young women standing in front of him were variables in an equation rather than human beings who had just been handed to a stranger without being asked. But here is the thing about Sims that history tends to skip. He was not a villain in the way we like our villains. Cold, obvious, easy to hate. He was, by all accounts, a devoted father. He wrote tender letters to his wife. He was charming at dinner parties. He genuinely believed, in the particular self-deceiving way of men who need to believe it, that he was helping. That is what makes him dangerous to understand. Monsters who know they are monsters are rare. Men who commit monstrous acts in the sincere belief that they are pioneers. That is something far more common, far more instructive, and far more terrifying. He had a surgical theory, a real one, a speculum fashioned from a bent pewter spoon, silver wire sutures that resisted infection in ways silk thread could not, a repair technique that, if it worked, would change medicine. And he had been handed 3 human beings that the law, the culture, and the moral architecture of the antebellum South had placed entirely beyond the reach of protection. There was one more thing he had. A belief, not a fringe belief, not a whispered one. A belief written in medical textbooks, taught in medical schools, repeated by respected men in respected journals. That Black patients experience pain with fundamentally less intensity than white patients. This was not science. It was a lie built to make the math work. A lie that allowed men to look at suffering and keep taking notes. A lie that meant you could operate without anesthesia and call it methodology rather than cruelty. Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy would spend the next 4 years paying for that lie. The barn. He converted a wooden outbuilding behind his Montgomery home into an operating theater, a table, restraints, space along the walls for the local doctors he would invite to observe. No climate control in the Alabama heat, no real sanitation, no anesthesia. The first operation on Anarcha was in 1845. She was restrained on the table. She was conscious. She was 17 years old. And when Sims made the first incision, and Anarcha made a sound that no instrument could measure and no notebook could honestly record, he continued. Then he scheduled the next one. In the name of science, the first operation failed. Sims sutured the tear with silver wire, closed the wound, and waited. For days, he monitored Anarcha with the focused attention of a man watching an experiment, rather than tending a patient. He noted her temperature, her output, the rate of healing. He recorded everything in neat clinical handwriting that transformed agony into data. Then the sutures failed. The tissue didn't hold. The fistula remained. He scheduled the second operation. The methodology of erasure here is something important to understand about James Marion Sims and the 4 years that followed. He was not sadistic in the way that word is commonly used. He did not take pleasure in pain for its own sake. He was not pacing the barn at night, consumed by darkness. He was indifferent, and indifference at scale, with a scalpel in its hand, produces the same result as cruelty, sometimes worse, because cruelty at least acknowledges that the person in front of you is a person. Indifference doesn't even grant them that. Sims operated on Anarcha with the same emotional register he might have brought to adjusting a piece of machinery. When the repair failed, he did not ask himself whether the woman on the table had limits that deserved to be respected. He asked himself what he had done wrong technically. He adjusted. He tried again. He invited other doctors to watch, to offer suggestions, to participate in the refinement of a technique that was, it must be said, genuinely revolutionary in its design. The science was real. The suffering was real. Both things were true at the same time. And that tension, that unbearable, infuriating tension, is what makes this story so much harder than a simple tale of a monster and his victims. What the operations were like. Let us not look away from this. Anarcha was brought to the barn and placed on the operating table. She was positioned on her hands and knees. The position Sims had determined gave him the best surgical access. She was restrained, though the records suggest that after the first few operations, restraints became less necessary, not because the pain diminished, but because Anarcha had learned, in the way that people learn things when they have no other choice, that resistance produced nothing except more suffering. There was no anesthesia. Chloroform had been demonstrated publicly in 1847. Ether was in use. These were not unknown technologies, but Sims did not use them on Anarcha, Betsy, or Lucy. He used them later on white women he treated in New York. The difference was not logistical. It was not a question of availability or cost. It was a question of who he believed was worth the consideration. The operations lasted anywhere from minutes to over an hour, depending on what he found when he opened the tissue. The silver wire sutures had to be threaded through living flesh, through a wound site that had already been cut before, through scar tissue that grew harder and less cooperative with each attempt. The speculum, that refined instrument born from a bent pewter spoon, had to be held in place by an assistant while Sims worked. When it was over, Anarcha was helped back to the small recovery room. She was given laudanum, opium, for the aftermath. Not during, after. When the screaming was done and the notebooks were closed, she lay in that room and healed. And then it started again. 30 times. The number needs to be said plainly and sat with. 30 operations. Over 4 years, James Marion Sims operated on Anarcha 30 times. 30 times she was brought to that table. 30 times the instruments went in. 30 times the silver wire was threaded through tissue that had already been cut and healed and cut again. 30 times she returned to that room and waited, in the particular way that people wait when they have no agency over what is coming next. She was 17 when it started. She was in her early 20s when it ended. Those are the years a person normally spends becoming who they are going to be, learning what they love, building something that is theirs. Anarcha spent them on a wooden table in a barn in Alabama, conscious, while a man refined his legacy on her body. The others in the room Sims did not operate alone. From the early months, he invited local physicians to observe. One of them was a respected Montgomery doctor named Thomas Zimmerman, a man who attended several operations, offered technical suggestions about suture placement, and later built a successful private practice on the strength of connections he made in Sims's circle. His name appears in Sims's correspondence as a collaborator, a colleague, a man of science engaged in a shared project. He never, in any document that survives, expressed a single reservation about what he witnessed. He was not unusual in this. The doctors who stood in that barn were not ignorant men. They were educated, professionally trained physicians who understood anatomy and pain and the biological reality of what they were watching. They came back session after session with their notebooks and their professional curiosity, and not one of them said, "This needs to stop." The system did not require monsters at every level. It only required men willing to look at what was directly in front of them and decide it was not their concern. What Betsy and Lucy endured history, gave Anarcha the most operations and therefore the most documentation. But Betsy and Lucy were there for all of it. They lived in close proximity in the recovery space Sims maintained, which means they witnessed each other. They were each other's only real witnesses, the only people in that barn who understood completely what the other had survived, because they had survived it too, in the absence of any testimony from them, because no one thought to ask or thought it worth preserving. We are left to imagine what their nights were like, what they said to each other in the dark between one operation and the next, what they found to hold on to. Betsy surfaces in Sims's notes in a particular way, referred to more than once as difficult, uncooperative, resistant in ways that frustrated him. In the language of a man who expected total compliance, difficult deserves to be read as something else entirely. It deserves to be read as the only word he had for a woman who had not yet finished fighting. Lucy's story contains one night that stands above the rest in its horror. After one of her operations, an infection set in that moved fast and deep. Within days, she was burning with fever, her body fighting a battle on 2 fronts simultaneously: the surgical wound and the invading bacteria that the unsterile conditions of the barn had introduced into it. The infection spread. Her temperature climbed. The women who attended her in the recovery room prepared themselves for the possibility that she would not survive the night. Sims noted this in his journal. He wrote about the infection with something approaching alarm, not the alarm of a man confronting his own responsibility, but the alarm of a researcher watching a critical variable destabilize. He recorded her symptoms carefully. He administered what treatments he had. He sat with the very real possibility that he was about to lose one of only 3 subjects his entire experiment depended on. Lucy survived. He continued. The day it worked. In 1849, the technique finally held. The sutures didn't fail, the tissue healed, the fistula closed. Sims stood in that barn and understood what had happened. 4 years. 30 operations on one woman alone, hundreds of adjustments to the wire, the speculum, the positioning, the suture tension, and now, at last, success. A surgical breakthrough that had never been achieved before. A repair that would go on to restore the lives of thousands of women across the world. He was right about the magnitude of what he had done, but here is the detail that history tends to skip past quickly. Anarcha, in that moment, did not celebrate. There are no records of her response. None were taken, none were preserved. But consider what that morning meant for her. Not the end of suffering exactly. The damage to her body across 4 years of repeated surgery was not erased by a successful final repair. What it meant was simply, it is over. The barn, the table, the hands, the particular dread of waking up and knowing what the day held. Over. Not triumph, not vindication, just over. Sims documented his success, wrote to colleagues, prepared the papers that would launch his international career. He packed his instruments, the speculum, now a precision tool that would bear his name in medical catalogs for the next century, and left Montgomery, left Alabama, left for New York, where a women's hospital was waiting to be built, where wealthy white patients would benefit from everything he had learned, where the medical establishment would receive him with thunderous applause. Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy did not go with him. There is no record of what happened to them next, no document confirming their emancipation, no letter describing their lives after the barn, no grave with a marker. History, having extracted what it needed from their bodies, set them down and moved on without looking back. They were in their early 20s, and the man who had spent 4 years operating on them, who owed them everything, wrote at length about his technique, his breakthrough, his legacy. He did not write their names. The lie that lived on the belief that made all of this possible, that black patients feel pain less intensely than white patients, did not die in that barn in 1849. It didn't die when slavery ended. It didn't die in the 20th century. A study published in 2016, not 1849, not 1920, 2016, found that a significant percentage of American medical students and residents still endorsed false biological beliefs about racial differences in pain tolerance, that these beliefs directly influenced the pain treatment those students recommended to real patients. The lie Sims used to justify operating on Anarcha without anesthesia was still circulating in American medical education 170 years later, still affecting real people, still costing real suffering. This is not ancient history wrapped in a bow and shelved in a museum. This is a wound that was never properly treated, a fistula that medicine tore open, used, and never fully repaired. In New York, the applause was still echoing. In Alabama, 3 young women were trying to remember who they had been before the barn. The glory of 1, the silence of 3. New York City in 1853 was the loudest place in the world, not just in sound, though the sound was constant, the clatter of iron wheels on cobblestone, the shouts of vendors on Broadway, the perpetual construction of a city that could not build itself fast enough to contain its own ambition. Loud in the way that cities are loud when money is moving and reputations are being made, and everyone within a 50-block radius is angling for position. This was the city James Marion Sims arrived in with a leather bag full of instruments and a story ready to tell. And New York was ready to listen. The art of becoming a legend Sims understood something that many brilliant men of his era did not. Discovery alone was not enough. You had to perform the discovery. You had to enter rooms correctly, speak at the right dinners, publish in the right journals, cultivate the right friendships. You had to make powerful men feel that your success was, in some indirect way, also theirs. You had to be charming enough that people wanted you to succeed, and humble enough that your success didn't threaten them. Sims was exceptionally good at all of this. He arrived in New York already carrying letters of introduction from respected Southern physicians. He gave demonstrations of his surgical technique that left audiences of doctors quietly stunned. He published his landmark paper on the repair of vesico-vaginal fistula in the American Journal of the Medical Sciences in 1852, a paper that laid out his method in precise, elegant detail, and sent ripples through the medical establishment on both sides of the Atlantic. The paper described the technique, it described the speculum, it described the silver wire sutures and the positioning and the years of refinement. It did not mention Anarcha by name, it did not mention Betsy, it did not mention Lucy. They appeared in the text only as cases, anonymous data points in a clinical narrative. Case 1, Case 2, Case 3. The women who had made the discovery possible were present in the paper the way scaffolding is present in a finished building, essential to the construction, invisible in the result. The Women's Hospital in 1855, with the support of a group of wealthy New York philanthropists, James Marion Sims opened the Women's Hospital of New York, the first hospital in the United States dedicated exclusively to women's medical care. It was, by any measure, a genuine achievement. The hospital treated hundreds of women in its first years. It became a training ground for a generation of gynecological surgeons. It established standards of care that had not previously existed in American medicine. Women who had suffered for years with conditions considered untreatable walked out of that hospital healed. Sims stood at the center of all of it, directing, operating, teaching, building. The philanthropists who funded him were the wives of Wall Street bankers and railroad magnates, women whose names appeared in the society pages of the New York Tribune, women who hosted fundraising galas in Fifth Avenue mansions, women who believed sincerely that they were advancing the cause of their sex by supporting this brilliant Southern doctor. None of them knew the names Anarcha, Betsy, or Lucy. None of them had been told. Sims did not lie about his past exactly. He simply arranged his story so that certain parts of it faced the light and other parts remained in shadow. He spoke warmly of his years in Alabama, of the challenge that had consumed him, of the persistence that had driven him to try again and again until he succeeded. He was the protagonist of his own history. The women on whose bodies he had built that history were background, setting, context. They were Alabama. He was the story. Europe in 1861, with the Civil War beginning to tear the country apart, Sims left for Europe. What followed was not simply a successful medical career abroad. It was something closer to a coronation. In Paris, he was received by the Académie de Médecine, with the kind of formal ceremony normally reserved for men who had been dead long enough to become monuments. French physicians who had spent careers on the same problems Sims had solved lined up to shake his hand, to examine his instruments, to ask him questions in accented English, while he answered with the quiet authority of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by his own importance. He treated the Empress Eugénie, wife of Napoleon III, and the fact of it was reported in newspapers on 2 continents as though medicine had crossed into royalty. In London, the Royal College of Surgeons granted him fellowship. He dined in rooms where the silverware alone cost more than a plantation hand earned in a lifetime. He moved through the highest levels of European society with the easy confidence of a man who had fully convinced himself that his past was simply prologue. And in a barn in Alabama, the women who had made all of this possible were living lives that no newspaper on either continent considered worth a single line. We do not know if Anarcha ever learned that the man who had operated on her 30 times was being celebrated in Paris. We do not know if she knew that her suffering had crossed an ocean and been transformed, without her name attached to it, into one of the most celebrated medical careers of the 19th century. We do not know, because no one thought to find out. The statue Sims returned to the United States after the war and resumed his career in New York with undiminished momentum. He became president of the American Medical Association in 1876. He published his memoirs, The Story of My Life, in 1884, a year before his death. The book was widely praised. It was the definitive account, written by the man himself, of how modern gynecology had been born. It was eloquent, self-assured, and carefully constructed. It described his years in Alabama as a period of heroic scientific persistence. It described his technique, his instruments, his breakthrough. Anarcha's name did not appear in it. Neither did Betsy's, neither did Lucy's. When Sims died in October 1883, the obituaries were unanimous. A great man, a pioneer, the father of modern gynecology, one of the most important figures in the history of American medicine. In 1894, 11 years after his death, A bronze statue was erected in Bryant Park in New York City. It depicted him standing, composed, dignified, in the long coat of a distinguished physician. His right hand held a medical instrument. His expression was the expression of a man who had seen far and understood much. On the base, his name, his dates, his title, father of modern gynecology. No other names. The three women without whom the title was meaningless. The three women who had paid for that title in the most direct and bodily way imaginable were not there. They were never there. What silence does. There is a particular kind of violence in erasure that is different from the violence of the operating table. The operating table was immediate, physical. It happened and then it was over, in the way that all immediate things are eventually over. Erasure is different. Erasure is patient. Erasure works across generations, quietly removing the evidence that certain people existed, that certain debts were incurred, that certain foundations were laid by certain hands. Erasure tells a story about a statue and calls it history. It fills medical textbooks with a name and calls it truth. It trains generations of doctors in a technique and never mentions where the technique came from. Not the barn, not the table, not the 30 operations, not the 3 young women in Alabama who had no choice but to provide the laboratory. By the time the 20th century arrived, James Marion Sims was simply a fact of medical history. A name on a building, a name in a textbook, a name on a statue in a park in the most important city in the country. And Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy were nothing. Not villains, not heroes, not cautionary tales, nothing. The most complete erasure is not when someone destroys your record. It is when the world arranges itself so thoroughly around your absence that most people never think to ask whether anyone is missing. For over a century, almost no one asked. The first cracks, but almost no one is not no one. By the 1970s, the women's rights movement had been interrogating the history of medicine with new urgency, asking who had been experimented on, who had been ignored, who had been used and discarded by a system that claimed to be in the business of healing. Feminist historians were pulling archives apart with questions that the official story had never bothered to answer. Who were the women? How many operations? Was there anesthesia? What did they consent to? And did consent even exist in that context? In 1985, historian Deborah Kuhn McGregor began the research that would eventually become the most comprehensive critical examination of Sims's work ever published. She went back to the original journals, the original papers, the correspondence between Sims and his colleagues during the Montgomery years. She was not looking to erase a legacy. She was looking for what the official story had left out. She found Anarcha, not a case number, not a data point. A 17-year-old girl, named, aged, described, present in the records in ways that Sims's published work had carefully obscured. McGregor's 1998 book, Sexual Surgery and the Origins of Gynecology, did not destroy Sims's reputation. It did something more lasting and more necessary. It put 3 names back into a story from which they had been deliberately removed. Anarcha, Betsy, Lucy. For the first time in 150 years, those names were in print, in a book, on record, permanent. The weight of those names. McGregor's work opened a door that could not be closed again. Medical ethicists began citing the case in classrooms, connecting the barn in Alabama to broader conversations about informed consent, about research ethics, about the ongoing racial disparities in American healthcare that were not accidents of history, but its direct inheritance. A new generation of historians built on her research. Medical schools began, slowly and unevenly, incorporating the full story into their curricula. And then, in 2017, a coalition of activists and medical professionals formally petitioned the city of New York to address the Sims statue in Central Park. They gathered in front of it. They held signs. They stood in front of a bronze man in a long coat and said in public the names that the base of his statue had never included: Anarcha, Betsy, Lucy. The city of New York agreed to remove the statue in 2018, 124 years after it was erected, 173 years after the first operation in that barn in Alabama. The The statue came down on a Tuesday morning in April 2018. A crew with equipment and a flatbed truck. No ceremony, no speeches. The bronze man in the long coat was lifted from his pedestal, loaded onto the truck, and driven away to a city storage facility. The pedestal stood empty, just a stone base in a park in Manhattan, bearing a name and a title and nothing else. And in that emptiness, in that brief silent space between what had been removed and what had not yet been decided, there was something that felt, if you were paying attention, like the first honest sentence in a very long story. The bill comes due. The pedestal stood empty for 3 days. No plaque, no replacement. Just a stone base in Central Park with a rectangular shadow where a bronze man had stood for 124 years. People walked past it, some stopping to photograph the absence, some not noticing at all. The city had not yet decided what, if anything, would take its place. That empty pedestal is where this story has been heading all along. Not to a resolution. Not to a clean ending where justice arrives and the ledger balances and everyone goes home feeling that history has corrected itself. But to a question, a real one. The kind that doesn't dissolve when you answer it. The kind that gets louder the more honestly you look at it. What do we owe the people whose suffering built the world we inherited? What the 20th century did with the silence. For most of the 1900s, James Marion Sims remained exactly what the 19th century had made him. A name on buildings, a name in textbooks, a name on a bronze statue that joggers passed every morning without a second glance. The American Gynecological Society considered him a founding figure. Medical schools taught his technique, the refined version, the version that had passed through dozens of hands since 1849, without mentioning the laboratory in which it was born. Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy did not appear in those textbooks. They did not appear in the lectures. They did not appear anywhere that a young medical student in 1950 or 1960 or 1970 would have encountered them. The silence was not maintained through active conspiracy. That is the thing about institutional silence. It doesn't require coordination. It only requires that the people with the power to speak choose, generation after generation, the comfort of the existing story over the discomfort of the complete one. And so the silence held, until it didn't. The medical establishment pushes back. When Deborah Kuhn McGregor's research brought the full story into public view in the late 1990s, the response from parts of the medical community was instructive. Not all of it, and not uniformly. Many physicians and medical ethicists received her work with the seriousness it deserved. But there was resistance, pointed, defensive, and revealing in what it chose to protect. The arguments came in a familiar shape. A prominent medical historian writing in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1999 argued that McGregor's framing was anachronistic, that judging Sims by the moral standards of the late 20th century was a category error, that consent as a formal concept did not exist in 1845, that anesthesia was not yet standardized practice, that Sims was a man operating within the framework available to him. These arguments deserve to be taken seriously enough to be answered properly. Yes, formal consent protocols did not exist in 1845, but the capacity to consent existed. Anarcha had a mind. She had a will. She had a body that belonged to her in every moral sense, even if the law said otherwise. The absence of a legal framework for consent did not mean she was incapable of having preferences about what was done to her. It meant that her preferences were not considered worth asking about. That is not a limitation of the era. That is a choice. And as for anesthesia, Sims used it on white women in New York. The technology existed. He made a decision, deliberately, about who deserved it. That decision did not emerge from the limitations of 1845. It emerged from a belief about the relative value of different human bodies that was already, even then, something a person could choose to question. Some people did question it. Sims did not. The living legacy. In 2016, researchers at the University of Virginia published a study that should have been impossible. They surveyed medical students and residents, people in training at one of the most prestigious institutions in the United States, in the 21st century. about their beliefs regarding biological differences between Black and white patients. 40% endorsed at least one false belief about racial biology. Among the most common, that Black patients have thicker skin than white patients, that Black patients have a higher pain tolerance, that Black patients' nerve endings are less sensitive. These are not obscure fringe beliefs. These are the direct descendants of the pseudoscientific racism that filled Sims's library in Montgomery. The same intellectual lineage, the same function to make the math work, to make it easier to undertreat, to undermedicate, to look at a person in pain and decide that the pain is probably less than it appears. The study found that these beliefs directly affected clinical recommendations. Students who held them were measurably less likely to recommend adequate pain management for Black patients. In 2016, in the United States of America, this is not a ghost story. This is not the distant echo of a dead era rattling its chains for atmosphere. This is a living system, still operating, still producing the same outcomes that the barn in Alabama produced, just with different instruments and different paperwork and the same essential calculus underneath. Some bodies matter more than others. Some pain is more real than other pain. Anarcha already knew this. She learned it on a table in 1845. The question is whether American medicine has learned anything different in the 180 years since. What was finally said out loud? In 2017, the campaign to address the Sims statue reached a tipping point. It was not a spontaneous uprising. It was the result of years of accumulated scholarship, of McGregor's research, of medical ethicists citing the case in classrooms, of activists connecting the historical injustice to the present-day reality of racial health disparities, of a cultural moment in which the question of whose history was being commemorated in public spaces had become impossible to avoid. The coalition that formed around the statue was not asking for Sims to be erased from history. They were asking for something more precise and more difficult. They were asking for the truth, for an acknowledgement that the foundation had names, that the technique had a cost, that the women who paid that cost deserved to be part of the story that medicine told about itself, not as victims, not as footnotes, but as essential, irreplaceable human beings without whom none of the achievement was possible. On April 17, 2018, the statue of James Marion Sims was removed from Central Park. The city announced it would be relocated to the cemetery in Upper Manhattan, where Sims is buried. A decision that satisfied almost no one completely, which is perhaps the most honest outcome available. History is rarely resolved. It is negotiated. The pedestal remains. At the time of this recording, it still bears his name. What was never recovered here is what we do not know, and likely never will. We do not know what Anarcha's voice sounded like. We do not know what she thought about on the mornings between one operation and the next. We do not know if she prayed, or who she prayed to, or what she asked for. We do not know whether she ever learned that her suffering had crossed an ocean and become prestige. We do not know whether she lived to be old. We do not know whether she ever experienced a single ordinary day in which her body was entirely her own, and no one had any claim on it whatsoever. We do not know her last name. We do not know Betsy's last name. We do not know Lucy's. This is the final and most irreducible form of the erasure. Not the statue. Statues can be removed. Not the textbooks. Textbooks can be rewritten. But the living detail of three women's inner lives, the texture of who they actually were beyond what was done to them, that is gone. That particular debt cannot be repaid. That particular silence cannot be broken, because the voices that would break it were never recorded. What we have is three first names, and the choice, our choice, right now, about what we do with them. Still here. In 2021, a statue of Anarcha was unveiled in Montgomery, Alabama, the first public monument in American history dedicated to an enslaved woman by name. She is depicted standing. Her posture is neither defeated nor triumphant. Her expression is the expression of someone who has survived something unsurvivable and is still here. That phrase deserves to land, because that is what Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy did. In the face of a system designed at every level to extract from them and discard them, in the face of a man who spent 4 years treating their bodies as equipment, in the face of 150 years of institutional silence that tried to complete what the barn had started. They did not disappear. They are here, in this story, because people refused to stop asking their names, because historians pulled archives apart looking for them, because activists stood in the rain in Central Park holding signs, because the truth, it turns out, is harder to erase than a statue. You cannot put a monument over a name and call it history. Not forever. Not when there are people paying attention. To the channel. This is why Faded Truth's history exists. Not to tear down, not to replace one incomplete story with another, but to find the places where the official version stopped short, where the scaffolding was removed and the building declared finished, and to ask simply and persistently, who else was in that room? Whose hands built this? What names are missing from the base of this monument? Anarcha, Betsy, Lucy, 3 women. No last names, no portraits, no graves with markers. And now, finally, incompletely, imperfectly, but permanently, a place in the story. The next time someone tells you medicine is neutral, remember a barn in Alabama. Remember a bent pewter spoon. Remember 3 names that took 170 years to say out loud.